And welcome most of all to our guest of honor, the brilliant Niall Ferguson, historian, commentator, Scot, Briton, and I think now American as well. I mean, that's brilliant timing, Neil.
Yeah, it's felt a bit counterintuitive to become an American citizen in, I guess it was 2018. But I am basically long the United States, despite the appearance that it has become one mighty dumpster fire. And I thought I was being very smart. I thought I'll be hedged. I'll retain my British citizenship so that if things go to pot in the United States, I can just go back home. Not really anticipating that the things would also go to pot back home. So I'm, currently shopping around for some third nationality. I was thinking maybe Taiwanese, because they at least seem to be able to handle a pandemic. But then the Chinese would probably invade the day I became a Taiwanese citizen. So what can you do?
You said there that you're long the United States. So you feel that there is. We'll come to the election in a moment. All very exciting. You feel that there's a case for being longer term optimistic about the US. Why? It's economic dynamism, its capacity for innovation.
Well, I think, contrary to the widespread belief amongst liberal journalists, the Constitution works. It still works. It's worked as designed to constrain a president who clearly had tyrannical impulses. It constrains him entirely as designed, in just the way that Alexander Hamilton said it would if a tyrant or tyrannical despotic person became president. So there's that. I don't think anybody's come up with a better constitutional arrangement so far that promotes liberty, both economic and political. I think that, secondly, the US still has this unique ability to import talent. I don't include myself in that category, but I see it very clearly in Silicon Valley and elsewhere. And so no other power has this capacity. The UK is actually the only competitor that in recent years has been able to translate immigrants into wealth in that way. China can't do that. Nobody wants to emigrate to China, and nobody does. Thirdly, I think China is definitely overbought. People are buying the propaganda to a degree that reminds me of the 1970s view that the Soviet Union was going to triumph and the US was doomed. And since I do work a lot in the 70s writing the biography of Henry Kissinger, I'm vividly reminded that people were writing off the United States after Vietnam and after Watergate, were convinced the Soviets were at least going to achieve convergence. And that was all wrong. And I think it'll be the same story with the US and China. People underestimate the self-repairing abilities of the US system. And the time to be long a stock is when it's kind of being shorted by everybody else. So people are so negative about the US at the moment that my contrarian impulses kick in. And I think actually the US is going to surprise, as they say in markets, to the upside.
So the election, where are we? If we'd been having this conversation maybe a couple of months ago, I think we would both probably have thought that Trump was going to win. Maybe sort of 2-3 months ago, I thought that he was at least in with a shot. But it looks, with less than 3 weeks to go now, it looks as though he's done for, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a little different from where I'm sitting. Prior to the pandemic, I was fairly sure he would get reelected. By February, I began to realize that they were going to mishandle it quite horribly. And then I began to mark down his chances, but still had it as close, given that the Democrats had really picked a quite weak candidate. But what's been fascinating in the last few weeks is a consensus formed a few months ago that it was going to be so close, be like 2000, and then Trump and his people would contest the results in multiple states, and in all kinds of nefarious ways would bring about the stealing of the election, the collapse of the republic, the Second Civil War, and the end of life on Earth as we know it. I think that was roughly the way one piece in the Atlantic. I think the Atlantic even had a kind of military coup dimension to the scenario. So at that point I said, oh, come on, you're overthinking this. It's going to be a decisive Biden win. because by that time, a couple of months ago, the polling was really just not changing, and the margin had been consistently like 6 points for the better part of the year. In fact, going right back to the beginning of the real clear average. And it's never that steady. There hasn't been an election since 1968 that had that steady a lead. So I said somewhere along the line, well, you're overthinking this with your visions of a constitutional crisis. Biden's is going to win. But unfortunately, annoyingly, that's now become consensus. And so, as I'm always bored of consensus the minute it forms, I think it was when I read Andrew Sullivan predicting a Biden landslide that I started to feel queasy. And I just think that one can't rule out the 1948 scenario when Gallup had Dewey on for the win, and they were off by a margin of something like 9 points. Truman won. Of course, you all know the image of Harry Truman holding up the newspaper, Chicago Daily Tribune headline, Dewey beats Truman. I just can't help wondering if something like that could happen. I think there's one important reason why it could. We know from one interesting survey that about 12% of likely Republican voters don't tell the truth to telephone pollsters. And I've had this confirmed by friends on the ground in swing states. There is a mood that is, if I say I'm going to vote for Trump, it's going to go into the Facebook database. I'm not going to tell you. So I think there could be a really big shy Trump vote out there that the pollsters are underestimating. I also think that a lot could still happen. The thing that happened in 48 was more that it wasn't just the polls were out, it was that Truman narrowed the gap in the last 2 weeks after they kind of stopped polling. And I don't rule out a change of direction. It happened 4 years ago. It was the reason he won. It was all about what happened in October when the negative news about Hillary Clinton basically killed her by narrow margins in the 3 swing states. So now that everybody thinks it's going to be a landslide, I think the correct answer is that the tails of the distribution are really fat. There is a scenario in which he is wiped out like John McCain was. And actually on present polling, he should be. I mean, he's actually further behind at 20 days out than McCain was 20 days out. And if you remember the McCain campaign, I was an advisor. We all thought we were toast at that point. It was just a question of how big a thumping we were going to get. So there's that scenario. He just could be wiped out and Biden could win as handily as Obama did. But I don't think, given the data, you can completely rule out polling error. It would need to be a much bigger polling error, though, for Trump to get to 270 electoral college votes. So you'd need something 1948 sized, or, for the benefit of this British audience, 1992 sized.
Yeah.
Iain, where were you in 1992 and how did you bet on John Major's chances in that election?
I was a student at Glasgow University and I was pretty confident that Labour were going to win.
I predicted and made some money in side bets with my then Oxford colleagues, a 20-seat Tory majority, and it was 22.
Right. Yeah.
And that was based on the intuition that the Tory vote was a good deal stronger and more resilient post-Thatcher than the pollsters were picking up. So I just wonder if, and I'm only going to give this a 10% probability, that there is some very big and nasty surprise for the same people who had a big and nasty surprise 4 years ago. And you know what? Let me tell you something. They kind of deserve it, because I don't think that the Democrats have learned anything from the experience of the last 4 years. I really, really don't. I think the elites in the United States are as disconnected from middle America as they were 4 years ago. And I sit looking at Nancy Pelosi on the TV last night thinking, you really actually deserve to lose this because of your sense of entitlement.
Yeah.
And fundamental failure to learn anything from what has happened in that past 4 years. So yeah,
that's the exchange she had with CNN
this sort of horrible train wreck of an interview, in which she just betrayed the phenomenal arrogance of the Democratic ruling elite. I mean, they are unable to reach a fairly straightforward decision to do further fiscal stimulus. I hate that term, fiscal offsetting relief.
Yeah.
And Wolf Blitzer was right. As a result, people are being laid off. Their incomes are collapsing. There is a crisis of poverty as people fall out of the middle class. And Pelosi, and it applies equally, I think, to her Republican counterparts in Congress, have just conspicuously failed to reach an agreement. And I think it's as much, if not more, the Democrats' fault, because I think they basically think they don't want to do anything that might help Trump at this stage. So I thought that was a very revealing interview, and it told you a lot about the way the Democratic elite, wealthy, California-based in Nancy Pelosi's case, tremendously wealthy. I mean, they have their vineyards in Napa. They've presided over a catastrophic period of misrule in that state, where I would normally be at this time of year. And here they are about to take over the United States if there is indeed a Democratic sweep. And although I have all kinds of issues with Donald Trump and have done from the get-go, there are moments when I so loathe the elite of the Democratic Party that I kind of want that 10% shock result to come in just to see their faces.
So if he does win the shock result, and the polling turned out to be wrong, just explain where that would happen in terms of the battleground, because obviously last time his path to victory last time was so narrow, and he got very lucky. It's only, I think, 80,000 votes spread across 3 key states that Hillary had not campaigned in properly.
Yeah.
She'd actually run a sort of anti-campaign in those states by kind of ignoring those voters. So he gets lucky last time. What would need to happen this time in individual states? And where are the key states for people to look at?
Well, it still obviously matters a lot what happens in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, that were the 3 states that decided it 4 years ago. It was 40,000, well, actually fewer than 40,000 people who made the difference. If they'd voted, those 40,000 or so people had voted Clinton, she would have won. So it was an extremely narrow margin of victory. But there are other states in play that one needs to watch. Florida's key. I think one of the things that could spoil the Democratic Party would be if Trump won Florida. Given that Hispanic voters in Florida in a number of polls have shown more support for the Republican candidate than they did 4 years ago, you can't rule this out. But the average polling still has Biden ahead there. There are a bunch of other states that are worth looking at, including Arizona, to name one. But I actually think if Florida goes clearly and decisively for Biden, it's all over, because I really don't see how Trump gets a path to 270 without Florida. And so it'll be a little bit like 2000 in that respect. Watching for the Florida result will really be key. Remember, there is this problem that is going to make it hard to get a classic clean-cut result on the night, and that is this massive increase in mail-in balloting and postal votes, as we would say in the UK. And that matters a lot in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, 2 swing states, because they don't start counting those mail-in ballots until election day. And so they're going to take a while to get to a result. So we may still be in some state of limbo on the 4th and maybe into the 5th. But I think if Florida is called for Biden on the night, that will signal that Trump is done, and that's the state I'll be watching most closely.
And do you think that, so if Trump has a way back into this, it's through some sort of shock event, something like Biden becoming seriously ill with COVID-19 is one possibility, I suppose, and there's still two and a bit weeks to go. And Trump does look quite energetic, doesn't he? In contrast to Biden.
Yes, I don't know how much that is medication and how much that is just all that Scottish DNA that he has from his mother's side. But there's no question that when you consider how many medical experts rated his chances when he was diagnosed as COVID positive, he has come out swinging, and that has definitely given some heart to Republican voters. But at the moment, I see Trump playing to his base. And that is not the constituency he needs to woo at the moment. It's the undecideds, it's those senior voters, older voters who are disillusioned with the handling of COVID-19. Doing rallies is something that Trump gets off on, and his supporters love it, but it's not really the key here to winning this. And so I wonder what could happen in the remaining days of this campaign to change the direction as dramatically as it would have to. There isn't really going to be a Biden scandal like the Clinton emails. There isn't a Comey moment coming. If anything, the news flow has been basically bad for Trump. He did massively screw up that first debate, and it alienated even his staunch supporters. My wife's security detail, Mike and Jerry, who were a brilliant focus group back in 2016, did not feel that debate went well. And if two ex-NYPD cops think their guy has been too aggressive, he's been way too aggressive. So I think the news flow this time around has been bad for Trump, whereas 4 years ago, apart from Access Hollywood, it was good for Trump. And I'm just struggling to see a deus ex machina at this point that saves him. What could make a difference is Biden's health, although not so much does he get COVID-19, it's more, does his mental decline become somehow inescapable? They have so far got away with the fact that he is an elderly man who is firing on fewer cylinders than he was just, I guess, a year and a half ago. I strongly suspect that Joe Biden suffered a mild stroke at some point before this campaign got underway, because I know Joe Biden slightly. We've met a number of times, and he's just seemed off to me on a number of occasions. And I don't think you can attribute this all to the famous stutter, which has been a great alibi. But I mean, I never really heard Joe Biden make the kind of strange verbal lapses that he's made this year. I think if he really had a disastrous public outing, which he didn't in the debate. In the debate, he held it together, and it was Trump who self-destructed. But if Biden were to have a really manifest lapse, that would, I think, reawaken what has been a worry in voters' minds about him. And remember, Kamala Harris is a heartbeat away from the presidency, and she's not a popular politician, and she did not win additional fans in her debate performance against Mike Pence. So weak as a long time in politics, Harold Wilson famously said this. Americans forget this. American pundits have completely forgotten it. They are acting as if it's all over, and it is not all over until the final vote is counted.
Hold that thought just for a second on Harris. What do you think happened in the debate? Because it was, I'm not remotely a Trump fan, but if you study his style, you can see that it was a very un-Trump-like performance. Where he's won in the past, he has deployed some humor. Now, it's not humor I'm sure to many of our listeners' taste, but because you'd be in jail, said to Hillary Clinton, is classic Rat Pack Las Vegas style comic timing. His remark about Prince Harry and Meghan a few weeks back before he got COVID, where he said, I wish Prince Harry all the best because he's going to need it. Now, that's funny. That's funny in a kind of Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin style interplay way. Why didn't he do that? He was exceptionally aggressive with no shade at all.
I think that the idea was to throw Biden off so that he would stumble. And I think that Trump was like a football team that sticks to its plan, even when the plan has failed within 5 minutes of the game kicking off.
Yeah.
Having failed to get Biden to stumble, Trump stuck with it and dug himself into a hole where he was at war with Wallace as well as with Biden, and it all helped Biden look good. So yeah, I think that was the game plan. It wasn't very smart, and Trump didn't have the sense to reposition himself as that more kind of engaging Donny from Queens persona. That when people interact with Trump in one-to-one settings or in small groups. I remember Bob Kraft saying to me, the thing about Donald Trump you have to understand is that if he were here with us now, we were having dinner in New York, he would be kind of engaging and you'd all be enjoying, his irreverent company. Secondly, he has no filter. So he kind of says what comes into his head, there is no filter, and third, he has no core values. And I remember being slightly stunned by that third observation, but it's true. And I think that's the key point here, that Trump has a charisma and an appeal. The permanent drama of the Trump years has exhausted many people, but it is also compelling viewing. And it has the same addictive quality that Twitter has if you're a journalist. The doom scrolling quality here is to me striking. People say they can't stand Trump, but they can't stop watching him. And I've always felt the biggest problem for the Democratic campaign would be just getting airtime. Even Trump's falling ill totally dominated the news coverage, culminating in that preposterous Leni Riefenstahl style video of the return to the White House in the helicopter, which, I mean, was the first time I really thought they had started working from a 1930s script or a parody.
Well, yeah, I mean, one of our team, one of the reaction team, Jack Dickens described it, I think, as Apocalypse Now Meets the Apprentice, which is a rather good way of putting it.
Watch the opening of Triumph of the Will, Riefenstahl's famous Nazi propaganda film. It begins with the plane landing in Nuremberg, and that was, to me, the allusion to Riefenstahl was just, it was as if they designed it to vindicate Andrew Sullivan's most terrified ruminations about Nazi America and the coming creation of Gilead. So I think that the Trump show probably isn't going to get a second series. I mean, if you ask me what's the base case, I think the base case is that the Democrats win. They win a narrow Senate majority. It's not a landslide, but they win an electoral college majority, and it's fairly clear, fairly soon, the week of the election, that has happened. That's my sort of base case at this point. The polling error will be there, but it won't be big enough to save Trump. And everybody's going to say, normalcy. So my analogy here, Ian, which is interesting, is with 1920, 100 years ago. 100 years ago, you don't just have a pandemic. You've come out of World War I. You've had a period of great upheaval, the so-called Red Scare. And Woodrow Wilson fell sick from the Spanish flu in 1919, wasn't able to run for re-election. Warren Harding, the Republican candidate, won in a landslide, and he campaigned on normalcy. And I think Joe Biden is the normalcy candidate here, and Trump is the kind of Woodrow Wilson figure who's got the disease in the pandemic that he's kind of being blamed for. So that seems like a good analogy here. But I would add one thing: people voted for normalcy in 1920; they didn't get it, and I think voting for normalcy Biden in 2020 will lead to anything but normalcy. There's a whole lot of disappointment lying ahead, I think, for those people who are excited at the prospect of a Biden landslide and the end of the Trump era. I think it's not going to be anything like normalcy for quite some time.
What do you think, just proving your point about the fascinating nature of the Trump personality? We'll come to the Biden presidency in a moment, if that's the way that it's looking. What do you think Trump does afterwards? Because it strikes me as one of the most fascinating parts of the story. At 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock or 7 o'clock in the morning, whenever it's clear what's happened overnight, and if it is Biden heading for a landslide, a fight begins, surely, for control of the Republican Party, which it's Trump's animal. He has most of has all of the key appointments on the RNC. At that point, do big money Republicans desert Trump? Does he stick around for the fight, trying to build a dynasty, or does he disappear or not disappear, but go off back to New York and start a new TV channel? What do you think his instinct will be?
Well, there'll be lots of litigation to take care of. I mean, one thing about losing the presidency is that you are suddenly in a whole new world of pain with all kinds of lawsuits that are going to be flying around. So that is going to eat up a lot of Donald Trump's time if he does lose.
And they'll be related to what exactly, do you think?
Taxes. But, where do you want to go? There are all kinds of ways.
COVID as well.
I think they can come after him, and I fully expect that will happen. I always thought it would end in a great welter of litigation, because most things that Donald Trump has done in his life have done so. So I think one shouldn't imagine that Trump will have great freedom of action. There'll be a lot of scores to be settled once he's no longer in the White House. I also think that from the vantage point of Mitch McConnell, there's already been very pronounced distancing. The minute Ruth Bader Ginsburg died as Supreme Court Justice, I thought at this point the interests of McConnell and Trump diverge. McConnell's focus is on holding on to the Senate, or at least making sure that the Democrats don't win a chunky majority that allows them to do all kinds of crazy stuff. I think McConnell distanced himself very pointedly from Trump in recent weeks. The Republican establishment would very much like to say, thanks for the memory, Donnie from Queens. Can we now get back to conservatism? So I think there'll be quite a strong impulse to do that. They can't afford to quarrel with him publicly, though, because he still owns this base of people who regard him as a kind of superhero, caudillo. And I think those people will need to be kept on board if the Republican Party is to have any future. So that's the challenge for the post-Trump Republicans. They can't repudiate Trumpism, but they definitely need to reversion it and repackage it by the time 2024 comes around, and actually sooner than that, because they really need to make some headway in the midterms. I think they will have the opportunity to do that, because I think a couple of things are going to go wrong in the Biden presidency, but you're going to ask me about that now.
Yeah. Biden presidency, what does it look like?
It's currently set up to be the most Keynesian presidency in history, with a massive up to $4 trillion spending package, only partly financed by higher taxes on corporations and the wealthy. And so that, I think, will be the focus. A lot of the people who served in the Obama administration think that the lesson they learned was focus on the economy. Everything else is going to distract you, and it's the economy that really is key. So I don't think Biden's people will want to be distracted by packing the Supreme Court or making DC and Puerto Rico states, or any of the other things that the progressive wing is itching to do. I don't think they'll want to go full Green New Deal with Ocasio-Cortez. Their environmental plans are going to be carefully designed to dovetail with their spending plans. So I think that's what they aim to do. But things, don't always work out quite as you plan in the world of politics. And I think a couple of things are going to be really key. One is, the economy is in a bad way in many respects, partly because they failed to keep fiscal support going. So things are rolling over. Potentially, you even have the risk of a double dip recession. And they're not going to be able to press the start button on their fiscal expansion for months. It won't happen on Inauguration Day. It's not going to happen until it's actually passed through Congress. So there's a real lag in which things are going to probably feel like they're getting worse. Secondly, they're going to have a foreign policy crisis, I predict, early on over China and specifically over Taiwan, because the Chinese are just waiting for the moment that Biden wins to say, oh, now that awful man Trump is going, you're going to take off the tariffs, aren't you? And you're going to take off all the things that you did to Huawei and other Chinese companies. And the Chinese are going to sort of wait for Biden's response. And if Biden's people have learned anything, it surely will be not to just say yes to that, but rather to say, well, we'll only do that if you do this. That would be my expectation. And the kind of things that interest Democrats when it comes to China are slightly different from the things that interest Republicans. If the Democrats want to get into the human rights question in Xinjiang, for example, if they want to get into the Hong Kong national security law, then I think you'll quickly see détente ain't going to happen. So I think there'll be a little bit of diplomatic dueling, but I predict that early on, China starts to apply significant economic pressure to Taiwan to see what the Biden folks do. And the problem for Joe Biden is that he has actually a relatively hawkish national security team taking shape, most notably with Michel Flournoy at defense. He himself, I think, is temperamentally more combative than Obama ever was. And what I anticipate happening is that things over Taiwan escalate quite quickly because the Chinese apply pressure and the US administration feels that it's being tested out, rather as Bill Clinton was. But this time you can't just send 2 aircraft carriers to the Taiwan Strait and expect the PRC to fold, because the problem with the US guarantee to Taiwan is that it's not credible anymore. You could sink those carriers with Chinese land-based missiles now. So I think the potential for a kind of intensification of Cold War II, which I've been writing about now for a couple of years, is quite significant. And it's the kind of thing that happens to democratic presidents, isn't it? I mean, you get elected full of great domestic policy programs, and the next thing you know, you're in a war. It happened to Wilson, it happened to Roosevelt, it happened to Truman. Kennedy and Johnson ended up in Vietnam. Carter nearly got into hot water over Afghanistan. It's actually only recently that democratic presidents have held back from conflicts. Clinton did until the last minute with Bosnia. And of course, Obama thinks his greatest decision was not to do anything about Syria, but just let it go to hell in a handcart. But I think the Biden presidency, part of the point of Biden is let's go back to the old days. Let's go back to the 70s. He's so much a kind of throwback politician. But that comes, I think, with this risk that when the chips are down, Democrats actually are more inclined to interpret commitments literally and to take seriously issues of human rights, which never meant anything to Trump when it came to dealing with China. So I think that's the thing that will blow them off course most likely. The fact that the economy is going to suck for a bit, and the fact that the Chinese are going to try out and just see what Biden's made of.
What's that going to mean for Europe, do you think? It looks as though the Biden administration is going to begin, at least, by being, if not completely anti-British, then pretty skeptical. They'll run to Merkel first, unless Macron can sort of rugby tackle Biden on the way. And Britain's going to be in a slightly embarrassing position. Is that fair?
Yes, I think that's reasonable to expect. I mean, I think the default setting will be to repair the transatlantic relationship, and that really means Berlin, Paris, Brussels. I don't think that there's any great sense of enthusiasm for Brexit amongst the Democratic foreign policy elite. They've all regarded it as madness. And the fact that Trump was in favor of it means that by default they must be against it. So I do think it's not going to be a win from a British point of view. But then, was Trump really doing anything for Britain? I mean, in truth,
No.
There were all these wonderful fantasies. I'm Daniel Hannan. I'm talking to you about free trade agreements with the United States and all this stuff. And I remember saying, it's not plausible. The US doesn't give a damn about any of this. If you tell Robert Lighthizer, do a nice free trade deal with the Brits, he's just going to give you that long, cold stare. So that was always, I think, a fantasy that Trump would meaningfully help with Brexit. I think he did no more than, endorse it in speeches. So I don't know that the situation radically changes in reality. I think Britain's problems aren't solvable by an American president of any kind at this point.
I think that their hope is that once you get sort of beyond 3 to 6 months, the morning intelligence briefing starts to count. And the reality is, once you've done the photo op with Macron and Merkel, you start to notice what's coming through on the Five Eyes network, and that Britain is a close partner, and you start learning more information about who in sub-Saharan Africa is trying to kill you. And in those circumstances, if any shooting starts, then Britain is a close ally, pretty much always is, and Germany's not much use.
Five Eyes is hugely important in the geopolitical architecture of the world, and it's hardly ever talked about by the professors of international relations, who don't look behind the facade of international agencies to see what really counts. The other thing that matters is finance. That's been central to my research over the years, and there is no financial market in Europe that is on London's scale. So there are all kinds of reasons why the US-UK relationship will remain an important one, regardless of Brexit. And I think in the end, for most people, the expectation is we get to breathe a sigh of relief because Joe Biden is a normal politician, and there won't be that terror that was associated with every Trump visit. The problem with this normalcy scenario is just Biden's age state of health, and there is this non-trivial prospect that at some point you actually get President Harris, and that would be a very, very different story. And most people in the European countries haven't really given this nearly enough thought. They haven't really bothered to ask the question, does Kamala Harris have a foreign policy? Who knows? She hasn't needed to have one. But the problem about being vice president is that your real job is understudy. At some point, you're actually likely to have to go and give and play the lead. And never has the probability been higher that a vice president would actually have to become president than in this scenario. So, yeah, I think that's why I said normalcy. You got to be kidding, because I think when you imagine the scenario of Biden being taken ill, Harris taking over, the Californian Democrats at that point are in charge of the most powerful country in the world. And as a California resident, I'd like to tell you that they have made the most almighty mess of California, the world's most successful economy, to the point that it is now on fire, because for 20 or more years, they have been able to prevent controlled burning from happening in the way that it traditionally did, turning the whole thing into a huge bonfire just waiting to be ignited. So the moment that Harris is sworn in, California takes over America. And trust me, if you haven't spent time in California recently, you have no idea what a mess they've made. San Francisco was a lovely city 20 years ago. I used to really enjoy going there. It is a total slum now that you would avoid unless you really had to go into town, such as the number of homeless people on the streets, feces in public places. It's a shocker. And I think that's a terribly worrying sign of what might come if the Democratic Party elite gets control of all the levers of power. So those people who think a landslide Biden victory will be the end of their troubles, that Mr. Trump will go away and normalcy will be restored, I think they're in for a big disappointment.
So we're going to take some questions now. We've got loads of questions to get through from readers and guests. Can I just point out to the students who are here from the Speakers for Schools program, if you're not a Reaction subscriber, you can become a student subscriber. It's free if you're a student, so just go to the website. We'll also get an email to you afterwards and you can sign up. So COVID, where are we?
Well, I said at the outset back in January, before people had really taken notice of this pandemic, pandemics are not over in months. They are multi-year affairs, and there is more than one curve that you need to flatten. There will be multiple waves. And sure enough, that's what's become clear. For the sake of brevity, so that we can get to lots of questions, I'll just say a couple of things. A vaccine is not a magic bullet. Even with 60% efficacy, if significant numbers of people decline to get it out of anti-vax sentiment, then we will still be playing whack-a-mole with COVID-19 through next year. And until Western governments get their heads around the fact that you have to do testing and tracing and isolating of infected people, we are going to do far, far worse than countries like Taiwan and South Korea, which got it right from the get-go. I think future historians will marvel at the ineptitude, not just of the UK and the US. There's been ineptitude across the Western world and a complete failure really to understand the necessary response to this kind of a virus. The future historians will realize that it can't all be blamed on Donald Trump and Boris Johnson, or for that matter, Dominic Cummings, that there was a massive failure of the public health bureaucracy. And I think it's still failing. I read, of the fact that Britain is conducting many more tests than its continental counterparts. That is true, but it's not enough just to do lots of testing. That has to be integrated with a contact tracing system and an effective way of isolating the infected. The opening of the universities, there are students on this call. I feel your pain. It has been a fiasco and an entirely predictable one. It's extremely hard to reopen universities in the midst of a pandemic. There's a reason Isaac Newton spent, I think, more than a year away from Trinity College during the plague that struck in his lifetime. This has been a tremendously badly handled part of the story. And it's the reason that there is a sudden increase in cases in the UK. If you just look at the areas with university student populations above 25%, that accounts for a huge proportion of the current UK wave. It's a miserable time to be an undergraduate. I have a 21-year-old son who's in this situation. It's just rotten. I can't think of a worse time to be forced to do social distancing. And I think this is all, I think, a consequence of a failure at the level of public health bureaucracy to understand how to deal with this. If the Taiwanese could do it, if the South Koreans could do it, and there are other Asian countries that have done well, the big mystery is why we couldn't.
Do you think is it possible that and Adrian Woolridge, his new book, along with John Micklethwaite, talks about a need to reinvent the state, and that actually this is long overdue, and that this is more than just a sort of short-term failure. Do you agree with them? And what would a sort of revitalized state look like? I mean, the state's going to get a hell of a lot bigger, unreformed or not.
I read their book and I liked the book. I read a recent spin-off article in Bloomberg. It left me a little dissatisfied, honestly, because I think that the crisis that we're seeing, the crisis of the administrative state, proves the problem with big government and is not an argument for more big government. It's not like the US doesn't already have a very big government. The question we need to be asking, which I don't think they do, is why the Department of Health and Human Services completely failed to implement a pandemic plan that existed on paper. Why did the Center for Disease Control and Prevention utterly bungle testing in the early months of 2020? Making these institutions bigger is not going to make them better, because there is a fundamental pathology in the bureaucratic or administrative state that in fact will be made worse by limitless money. The prospect of another $4 trillion of spending, call it 2 or 3 trillion on the federal debt, the belief that universal basic income is now mainstream and that modern monetary theory is now mainstream, all of this is just going to make those pathologies worse, because there's not going to be any constraint on government. So I think the diagnosis is wrong. And if you actually spend time in countries that have competent government, like Taiwan's, what strikes you is actually the relatively light touch of government and its tech savviness. The fact that Audrey Tang is a minister, the former cyberpunk tyro in the Taiwanese government, helping them think about cyber issues, tells you that they're in fact doing 21st century government. Technology means that government should be small. We should have been able to use technology, for example, to deploy a contact tracing app across the nation. The fact that that didn't happen is actually quite bizarre, and I think reflects both the pathologies of the administrative state and of big tech, that they were too risk averse to take it on. So no, the future is not more big government. The future is not back to the mid-20th century any more than it is in China, which is, on reflection, kind of the project. For Xi Jinping, we're going back to some Maoist version of China, at least ideologically.
Yeah.
Brexit was back to the 70s economically. And the US is voting to go back to the 70s. And the political economy of the 70s was an utter failure. So why would you want to try again? I mean, I never really understood nostalgia of the 70s. I was around, I hated the 70s. The only good thing about the 1970s was punk rock. So 21st century government is going to be small, and the countries that understand that are actually going to be able to shrink the state and empower individuals, voters. And I think that's the exciting prospect. So everybody should go to Taipei. That's my strong advice. Don't go to Beijing. It's awful. Go to Taipei, where you actually will see Chinese democracy working and technology serving individual liberty. That's the key.
Woody Allen was good in the 70s as well.
And we don't talk about him anymore because he was cancelled, Ian.
I've never heard of him.
I don't know who you mean.
Any of his films. I can only apologize for having thought. Maybe we should go back to the 1870s. Really good question from Max Munson. Why have there not yet, emphasis on the word yet, been any bank failures as a result of the pandemic? And he asks, is that because the the measures put in place after the last crisis, greater emphasis on liability of senior managers, etc., recapitalization, higher capital levels, all of that, has that worked? I mean, I don't think this story is over by a long way, and I just think what's happening with commercial property, I think, is one of the big stories of next year, but we'll see. But sorry, your view.
Yeah, it's not over. That is completely right. But what we've seen since March has been this combination of enormous income support and then zero rates and a quiet shift in the nature of the Fed's inflation target. So there's been this benign boom from the point of view of financial assets. Any financial asset has rallied massively since the crisis of March on the back of those two policies, meaning that balance sheets are not that badly impaired. But your question is right in that the reforms post-financial crisis, particularly with respect to bank capital adequacy, did meaningfully improve the health of bank balance sheets in the US. And I think that's really a big part of the answer. Almost the only thing that we fixed after the financial crisis was the undercapitalization of the banks. But Ian's right to say that there's trouble in store, because there is a whole bunch of bankruptcy coming down the pike at high speed from small and medium-sized businesses that are giving up the ghost.
Yeah.
And I think that in the big cities, New York, London, San Francisco, God, it's a ghost town. I mean, there is going to be some meaningful pain, and that is going to require aggressive write-downs. But I think I'm much more worried about the European banks than I am about the US banks, which are in fact in pretty strong shape. Look at the latest Goldman results. The European banks are a nasty little problem that hasn't really gone away and hasn't really been resolved. So yeah, I think that's where I would be short. At the moment, the US banks have in fact come through this crisis thus far in very good shape.
Well, I've just on my desk here, I just discovered the other day, it's a story that never really happened from last year, and then the crisis took over, which is the Credit Suisse notes on the revenge of the plumbing system and what was sort of wrong with the global banking system. So I think that's a story
well,
for
I did an
next year.
update to the Ascent of Money, Ian. I did a new edition 10 years on in 2018 with 2 new chapters and tried to make the argument that we hadn't really fixed the system that well, aside from bank capital adequacy, that a financial revolution was brewing in fintech as well as in cryptocurrency. And I concluded that updated edition by saying there would be another crisis and it would likely come from China. I didn't have specifically a pandemic in mind, but the point was just that China had become so much a part of the system and is so obviously the likely point of origin of the next crisis that part wasn't difficult to foresee. And I think you should also keep an eye on the Chinese financial system, which is under considerable stress. Given this drastic slowdown in growth that they've experienced this year, people just assume that the Chinese have solved this problem. Sure, they were to blame for the pandemic to begin with, but they've handled it brilliantly. And this is a very superficial reading, I think, of what's going on in China right now.
So 2 questions on pandemics. First one from Joe Carter, which is, which past pandemic would you say has had the most significant impact on world history? And then Nicole asks, what's your opinion on the Swedish approach to COVID-19?
Well, in terms of magnitude, there's no question that the Black Death, the bubonic pneumonic plague that swept Europe in the 1340s was the biggest. I mean, that could have killed almost a third of humanity, so far as we can calculate, right across the Eurasian landmass. And so the easy answer is that one. Then you asked, well, what exactly were the consequences? And I've written a bit about that in a new book with the cheerful, rather Scottish title, Doom, The Politics of Catastrophe. There were huge transformations in Europe brought about by the population reduction, which was between a third and a half, depending on where you looked. It was ultimately beneficial, not immediately, but ultimately beneficial for the peasantry, for the people working the land. And you can connect this big demographic shock to all kinds of directions that Western Europe went in after the 1340s. So I'd have to back the Black Death, and second in line, I guess, would probably be the 1918-19 influenza pandemic. But it's really hard to disentangle its consequences from the consequences of World War One. So yeah, that's my answer to the first question.
Because you get, presumably on the, post the Spanish flu, you get two mutually reinforcing but contradictory phenomenons. You get the Roaring Twenties, so you get a sort of boom time, state of mind as people want to move on from it, and simultaneously you get what happens in Europe, in Germany in particular.
But it's so hard to disentangle this from the impacts of the war, and indeed the impact of the financial and monetary policies that followed the war. It's almost impossible to do that. And I'm skeptical of those people who make big claims about the consequences of the Spanish flu. Sometimes pandemics don't have consequences. 1957-58 influenza pandemic was as bad as this COVID-19 pandemic in many ways, but who now remembers it? And it didn't really have any consequences. The key here is that this pandemic is not historically a big one. It's maybe number 25 in the pandemic list, but its economic consequences are vastly greater than those of previous pandemics because of the way we handled them. And that brings me to Sweden. If you line up the European countries, or indeed all the developed countries, by the stringency of measures that they implemented, this is something that Blavatnik School at Oxford has been doing great work on. Sweden has the lowest score in terms of stringency of government policy, and the UK is quite high. And so the debate over Sweden's response, I think, has been caricatured as if it was a herd immunity strategy and nothing else was really done. But that's not true. What happened in Sweden was social distancing. Considerable measures were taken to try to prevent spread, but they didn't do lockdowns because they rightly saw that lockdowns were a really blunt instrument that would have costs in excess of their benefits. And that's the takeaway. I've been saying this since March, when it was first proposed to do lockdowns by the other Niall Ferguson, not me, the guy spelt Neil. And it was so obvious that this would just cause huge unintended consequences without really going to the heart of the matter. The key thing with SARS-CoV-2 as a virus is that it spread through super spreaders. 20% of the people do 80% of the spreading roughly, and it disproportionately kills the elderly. And so a blanket lockdown is an extraordinarily inefficient way of dealing with this virus, which is why Taiwan didn't do it and South Korea didn't do it. And Sweden was right not to do it. And we should have, I think, acted quite differently. That's not to say we should just have let it rip. That's the mistake that many people infer. Sweden made mistakes. Their elderly care homes suffered almost as many deaths proportionately as ours did. They got that wrong. But they did respond in all kinds of other ways to try to limit the spread of the virus. Just they didn't shut their economy down, which we did. And I think with the benefit of hindsight, that was clearly a mistake.
So Frederick Eriksson says, thank you for an excellent conversation. You're long on the US and short on China. What's your position on Europe? I think I can guess based on what you said about European banks, but.
Well, I kind of long the euro because I think one obvious consequence of what the US is doing will be dollar weakness over the next few years. I mean, this is just a massive monetary splurge, which Europe can't match. I mean, there's no way that you're going to be able to repeat the European Recovery Fund again and again. That's a one-off. And so Europe can't match the fiscal effort. I mean, roughly speaking, the US fiscal response to COVID is 2 or 3 times that of the major European economies. So I think I'm quite sure the euro will appreciate, and that will only add to the deflationary pressures that you can already see in Europe. Europe's basically going to be Japan, or at least Germany is Japan. Mm-hmm. That is to say, it is stable, it is elderly, It still has all kinds of cool stuff that it does better than everybody else, but it is not going to be able to achieve the kind of dynamism that is possible elsewhere. Elderly societies are not going to be dynamic. Societies like that, I think, have a predictable path that leads them in the direction of steadily accumulating debt and very low inflation and relatively low growth. So that's my kind of view, with the caveat that Southern Europe still has the unresolved problem of the Italian debt to look forward to. Currently, that problem's on hold thanks to ECB largesse, but the nasty fiscal arithmetic of Italian public finances has not gone away, and it will come back at some point relatively soon. Last thought, the migration crisis. My wife, Ayaun Hirsi Ali, has a new book coming out called Prey, about the consequences of the great 2015-16 influx. There will be further inflows, and they will grow larger because of the disruption that there has been in North Africa and indeed further south, as well as in the Middle East and South Asia. And so Europe's going to be grappling with that problem, potentially on an even larger scale in the years to come. So no, I'm not massively long Europe in the general sense that your question implied, but I wouldn't mind having some exposure to euros in the next couple of years.
So let's go. We've got time for a couple more questions. Let's go UK. Now, Gary asks, rather giving away which party he votes for, in light of 10 years of Tory rule or misrule, COVID-19, the unsuitability of Johnson as Prime Minister during this crisis, and the competency of Starmer as an opposition leader, is it a done deal that the next government will be a Labour one? And then I just wanted to ask you really about Boris, who we both have experience of and views on. But Labour government coming up?
Well, if a week is a long time in politics, 4 years is an eternity, and a lot can happen, including the Tories could change their leader if they felt ultimately that Boris couldn't get it done. I don't think, looking at the polling, that this is by any means all over. Again, you've got to filter out media noise. This is so easy to succumb to, but in the Westminster bubble, there is this need for a narrative, and the narrative of Boris crashing and burning and the Tories utterly screwing everything up and Labour with its brave new leader. It's a very attractive narrative, but the polling doesn't show anything like that big a swing. So yeah, I think it would be premature to assume that Labour has learnt from the past. It's learned not to have a Trotskyist as its front man. I could have told them that on day one. They've gone back to having someone respectable. Incidentally, did you know that Keir Starmer went to school with Andrew Sullivan, and they used to be debating opponents? Yes. Loved that little snippet.
Apparently, Starmer, which is to his credit, is still very much in touch and friendly, and I was really impressed by that.
Yes, that speaks well of him, and so one doesn't feel the same anguish at the prospect of Keir Starmer as Prime Minister as one did thinking of Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister. That matters a lot. In the end, having a plausible candidate is pretty key. So you would have to assume that the pendulum, as it usually does in British politics, would swing at the next election, absent a drastic improvement in performance. And I share, the implication of your question that the Tories this government has not done well. Britain has not performed well. It has the worst performing economy in the OECD in 2020. And I think if you had to rank governments on not just response to pandemic, but public communication, Britain would come bottom of the class. It's been abysmal. And I think there needs to be some hard questions asked, not just about Boris, we'll come to him in the remaining seconds, but about the way the whole British state responded to this crisis, because I think it did not do at all well. And that's important, because part of Dominic Cummings' credo is that there is a problem with the British state and it needs to be addressed. I actually think he's right about that, and COVID has laid those problems bare, just as it's made clear that Britain's problems were not all the fault of Brussels and were not likely to be fixed by divorce.
I think that the problem with that is, I think you're right. I agree with some of his analysis about or diagnosis of the problem, but Britain's a parliamentary system. And if you want to get stuff done in that arena, you want to change the state, you have to be really good at parliamentary politics, even with a majority of 80. Yeah. And Dom, for all his many strengths, and there'll be some people scoffing at that, but he does have a very perceptive analysis of the British state. He loathes institutions, whether that be whether that be Parliament or, you know, historically the Tory party. The Tory party is pretty ruthless, and when the Tory party works out that its future is shackled to someone who can't stand the Tory party, that might have been fine for December last year, but it presents longer term problems. I just want to ask very quickly, just finally, about Scotland. We've got loads of questions about Scotland. Various people asking me about the opinion polling, which we're not going to mention because it shows, I don't know, 189% of Scots now want to leave the Union tomorrow or something dreadful. There's a poll out tonight which says 58% for independence. So there is a lead being built. Will Scotland leave the UK? Gavin Weir asks. Adam Brown asks pretty much the same question. And Christian asks, what's your view on the polling out today showing a huge lead for independence? Is it becoming inevitable, do you think?
I haven't seen the poll, but I'm not surprised. I think it was always pretty likely. You and I discussed this, that Boris Johnson, while he might be appealing in the north of England, is everything that the Scots despise about the English in one corpulent body. And it was always, in my view, a big risk that the emergence of Boris from the Brexit imbroglio would actually strengthen the case for independence. I think Brexit itself and the way that it took up all the oxygen in British politics for 4 years became an argument for Scottish independence. I campaigned energetically in 2014 against independence. I would not have the same fire in the belly if I had to do it again. And I would be, I think, a good deal less confident in my arguments that Scotland's future lies in the Union than I was 4 years ago. I do my best because I don't really believe in the independence project. The idea that Nicola Sturgeon would like us to have of Scotland is as a sort of Scandinavian or Baltic country, but it's actually much more Balkan to my eyes, the way the SNP runs Scotland. And I think it would be much more Balkan in its performance in the event of independence. It would be quite a poor country, let's face it. And nobody really does want to face that as they sing Flower of Scotland into their wee dram. My attempt to make my peace with this, Iain, has come from reading the novels of Walter Scott, which I'd never read until this year. Somehow there was a prejudice against Scott. In my young day, he was considered boring. And in fact, he's not. Scott is a wonderful writer, and I am besotted with the Waverley and its successors, the great series of novels that Scott wrote. And I think for any Scot, or indeed any English reader, or Welsh for that matter, it's absolutely fascinating to be reminded of the contingencies that brought Scotland and England together. And there were contingencies. The fact that Elizabeth I had no issue and James VI succeeded to the throne. The fact that the Scots went bankrupt in the Darien disaster and had, in effect, to unite the parliaments. I've come round to the view that we should not regard these political arrangements as set in stone, inexorable and unchangeable. And maybe in the end, it is for the best if we turn the clock back all the way to the 16th century and run the experiment of an independent Scotland. Just let's remember what Scotland was like, though, before its merger with England. It was essentially the Afghanistan of early modern Europe, an extraordinary place that combined warring mountain clans, extraordinary bloodthirsty in their culture, and fanatical Calvinists in the lowlands. It was a singularly unpleasant and dangerous place, far more violent than England. And essentially, Scottish history looked steadily up the more the Scots integrated with England. I'm at this point, having been away from Scotland for many years, inclined to say, good luck, best of luck. with independence. I shall watch from afar, but try to avoid becoming the Afghanistan of Europe again, because that wasn't much fun.
My concern is, well, other than just the fact that I'm Scottish and British, and it would involve the breakup of my country, Britain. My concern is that you'd be reawakening a lot of those old tensions and enmities, that essentially the Union was a solution to a problem, which was that England saw itself as having a hostile power to the north that was prepared to consort with France and others. And here the nationalist plan is to carry on apparently still trading with England as is now, expecting the English to be nice about it while attempting to rejoin the EU, which the English are not very keen on. So I think it would open up a sort of historical set of questions which the Scots haven't had to think about for several hundred years. Anyway, let's see.
Might do them good, Ian. It might do everybody some good to think about this stuff again. And perhaps after a period of what would be rather impoverished independence, they might come back and seek to renegotiate the union in just the same way that at some point there'll have to be some renegotiation of the relationship with Europe, because what we're currently moving towards, I think, is not really workable for the long term. So I think as an historian, I'm more and more inclined to see institutional arrangements of the sort we're discussing as liable to change over time and rarely, if ever, set in stone. And that part of the way to make your peace with life is to accept that such changes may happen on your watch, and maybe for the worse, but maybe, in fact, at this point, inevitable. So I'm no longer in that state of mind I was in 2014, that this would be, the end of the country I belong to, because I think that's the wrong way to think about the world. Things change, they are in flux, and that surely is the most important insight of history. And the key thing is, they don't change gradually. They change suddenly. There's a lot of punctuated equilibria in the past, and that's why I wrote this book, Doom, because the history of the world is really a history of disasters of various magnitudes, mostly unanticipated, some man-made, some natural. That's why there's no cyclical theory of history, and things happen very, very fast rather than in gradual cycles. I had to plug my book, even though it's not out yet, because
when's it coming out?
Justify all this zooming, isn't it?
When's it coming out?
Probably not until the spring.
Okay.
I haven't got a pub date yet, but I'm at the copy editing stage. You know what that's like. Excellent.
Well, we look forward to that. And I just will draw things to a close. I just want to thank everyone for tuning in. If you're not a Reaction subscriber, very easy to become one. You get my weekly newsletter, all the great work that the team does, and invites to events like this. But most of all, I want to thank Niall Ferguson. An absolutely fantastic, fascinating conversation. It was great talking to you in Montana, and I hope it won't be too long before I see you in the US, or you come and join us for a drink in the UK.
Yeah, here's to the roaring 20s. I just fear they probably won't start until about 2023.
As long as they don't end like 1929 or 1933.
Oh, that too. Remember, vote for normalcy, get the 20s.
On that uplifting and cheering note, thank you very much, Niall Ferguson, and thank you very much for joining us. Good night.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks to everyone for the great questions. Bye.